Good evening. My name is Isabelle Teare with the WTJX NewsFeed, and this is Trial Watch. We are covering the case of the United States of America versus Ray Martinez and Jenifer O'Neill. Ray Martinez is, of course, the former commissioner of the Virgin Islands Police Department. Jenifer O'Neill is the former director of the Virgin Islands Office of Management and Budget. And both, this is a high-profile case, and both of these are high-level former government officials, both of whom are charged with honest services wire fraud, bribery concerning programs receiving federal funds, and money laundering conspiracy. And then Ray Martinez is also charged with obstruction of justice, but Jenifer O'Neill is not facing that charge herself. Now, let's dive into what happened today. The majority of the day was dominated by jury selection. But before jury selection happened, there were oral arguments. So the judge could rule on certain requests that the defense attorneys for Ray Martinez and Jenifer O'Neill were making. Now, those oral arguments centered around the defense wanting to bring in certain evidence involving certain evidence regarding David Whitaker. That's a name you're going to hear a lot throughout this trial. He's the lead witness for the prosecution, and he's the owner of Monethos Pro Support, a company that you're going to hear about a lot. If you tuned in for the Calvert White trial, that name and that company is going to be familiar. Now, just so all of you can understand, there was a bit of a fiasco in terms of the public hearing the oral arguments this morning. What happened is the jury pool for this case was so large that there was no room for the public to view the case in the main courtroom until the jury pool was narrowed down and chosen. So they put the public in another room, and we were going to be watching jury selection on a monitor, on a TV monitor. However, when these oral arguments this morning began, we couldn't hear, the audio wasn't working. So we tried to go upstairs into the courtroom. We weren't allowed. We were then sent back downstairs, and then finally the audio did start working, but everyone in the public did miss the beginning of those oral arguments and a bit of them. But I can tell you what I did hear. And then I also spoke to an attorney who had knowledge about what happened in the room, and he, filled in some gaps for me. So what the oral arguments centered on was, as I said, a prior criminal conviction of David Whitaker, the lead witness for the prosecution. And this was a conviction that happened in 2008 in Rhode Island. I can't tell you about the nature of that whole case or any details. All I know is that it involves some kind of fraud, or, the conviction was similar to one of fraud. And the defense attorneys for Ray Martinez were arguing that the details of this case, this 2008 conviction and all of that, should be allowed. He said the jury needs to know that David Whitaker is a routine liar, that they have a right to know about prior convictions. And he said how David Whitaker had come out of prison after this conviction and immediately began committing fraud again. The defense attorney for Jenifer O'Neill, his name is Dale Lionel Smith. He kind of piggybacked on that argument and agreed. He said that David Whitaker's credibility was essential to his defense of his client. Now, here's what they're arguing against. The prosecution in the United States say that these prior convictions can't be let in because of something called Rule 609B. And just a very quick summary of Rule 609B, it's basically that any criminal acts that happened more than 10 years ago can't be brought into this case. So that time clock, it begins ticking when the person is released from prison, not when the act happened. And David Whitaker was released around 2012, 2013 for this Rhode Island conviction. Now, 10 years would have been 2022, 2023. But the attorney explained to me that there are certain balancing tests they do when the time period is kind of close to that 10 years about whether or not that is going to really influence the case. So what happened was the judge ended up granting in part the defense's motion to admit that Rhode Island previous conviction. The judge for this case is Judge Mark Kearney. He's the same judge who presided over the Calvert White and Benjamin Hendricks trial. And what he said was that he was going to allow the defense to bring in that conviction and ask only very certain questions about it. Very, very limited questions. What they were allowed to ask was basically just, what was the crime and what was the sentence? They're not allowed to get into any of the details of that. And they're not allowed to get into any details of any other previous crimes committed by David Whitaker under this Rule 609B. The judge said that the probative value of the Rhode Island conviction did substantially outweigh any prejudice that would be brought to the case of the United States. And he also said he was allowing it because that conviction was so close to fraud. Okay, now we can go ahead and move into jury selection. A quick note, though, I want to give you an observation about what we saw happening in court. Ray Martinez sat at one table between his two attorneys. Jenifer O'Neill sat at the other with her one attorney. And Martinez was wearing a gray suit. He seemed very attentive. He had a stern expression on his face. And Jenifer O'Neill was also very attentive. Both of them, watching, paying attention, but not a lot of expressions otherwise. So for jury selection, it was a very large group of people, as I've said, and I believe I couldn't see all of them, definitely above 50 people. And Judge Mark Kearney began by just introducing himself, getting the jurors sworn in, and explaining the duties that the jury was going to have to perform throughout this trial. Now, once the actual questioning of the jury began, the attorneys spun their chairs around to directly face the gallery where the jurors were sitting, and the defendants did as well. So Ray Martinez spun his chair around, and throughout the entire questioning of the jury, he had a legal pad out, and he was taking notes, really paying attention to what jurors answered what questions alongside his attorneys. So I'm not going to tell you every question that was asked of the jury, but basically there was a lot of things trying to understand if anyone in the jury had any kind of familial or business or any kind of personal relationship with either Ray Martinez or Jenifer O'Neill, these two defendants. And then if they did have any kind of personal relationship, what that was, etc. They also went into naming people who were going to be called as witnesses in the case, or people who were going to be mentioned a lot throughout the case. And they asked similar questions. Did anyone in the jury pool have personal, business, familial relationships with these people? And if so, had anyone had unfavorable encounters with these potential witnesses or other people that might make it hard for them to have an impartial mindset going into this case? I'm not going to read off every name that was brought up, but some of the big ones were Lisa Alejandro. She is the current commissioner for the Department of Property and Procurement. Charlie Irons, he's an employee for Yacht Haven Grand. David Whitaker, of course, the lead witness. Kiernan Whitworth, he's the FBI special agent who investigated the case, and he's also going to be testifying for a good amount of time during this trial. And then some other names brought up that we're going to hear throughout the trial. Mario Brooks, he is the current commissioner for the Virgin Islands Police Department. And then a group of other people. But we'll hear about those when we actually get into the trial later this week. An example of some more detailed questions that were asked of the jury pool were like, is anyone involved in law enforcement? When that question was asked, 23 jurors said they were. And then a follow-up was, how many of those 23 had worked under Ray Martinez during his tenure as a a police commissioner, and 5 people said they had worked under him. Then a moment of levity in court today. One of the questions that the judge asked was if anyone had heard or read anything about this case, but he couldn't even finish his sentence before the entire room kind of erupted in laughter and almost every jury card went up. This is obviously a very high profile case in the territory. It's going to be hard to get a juror that hasn't heard anything about it. But then that question was followed up with, has anyone made up their mind about the guilt or innocence of Ray Martinez or Jenifer O'Neill already, based on what, their knowledge? And one person raised their hand. So after this more public jury questioning process, what happened was the attorneys went up and met with the judge in something called a sidebar. And this is not something that we can hear, the public can hear, or anyone in the gallery can hear. And this is where they get into the real nitty-gritty jury questions. They pull individuals up, ask them questions that I can't hear and relay to you. And that lasted for hours and hours and hours today. Now, while that was happening, Ray Martinez and Jenifer O'Neill were sitting, in the courtroom, but throughout that entire time period, I didn't see them communicate once with each other. I didn't even see them look at each other once. They were very much so separate and not engaging. And so after this long period of sidebar related to jury selection, finally at 3:10 p.m., Judge Mark Kearney stood up and said that the jury pool had been selected. And it's a pool of 15 people. So they went and they called up the individual jurors who are going to make up our jury pool for this case. We have 11 women and 4 men. There are alternates, but I don't know how many of these people, of these 15 are alternates. And also, none of the 15 know whether or not they're an alternate or not. I spoke to an attorney who explained to me they're not told if they're alternates because the court wants them to be paying attention as if they are going to be in the room at the end of this case, deciding on the verdict. So after this, the judge excused everyone for the day early. That was because there was no lunch break. It was a long day. And rather than, getting into opening arguments, he decided that we were just going to start tomorrow fresh with the opening arguments from the prosecution and the defense. That will start at 8:30 a.m. tomorrow. After the opening arguments, we will then hear from the first witness that the prosecution is going to call. And while I can't say this for 100% certain, I have reason to believe that the first witness is going to be Lisa Alejandro. That is the current commissioner for the Department of Property and Procurement. So after everyone was dismissed, court was over for the day. And the real meat of this case, of this trial, if you will, that's what we're going to get into starting tomorrow. So I will be back here tomorrow evening for another edition of Trial Watch. I hope you'll tune in and watch then. Once again, my name is Isabelle Teare with WTJX NewsFeed, and this is Trial Watch. Thanks for tuning in.